My name is Claus, and I'm doing 100 innovation keynotes in 100 days. Today is keynote number 36, how to pick your innovation projects. So to start out with, the simple answer is it depends. There's so many variables in that question. There's so many things to choose from, so much circumstance to be taken into account. The only real and truthful answer I can give you is it depends. But if we ignore that for a moment, if we say, okay, if it depends, Mr. Smarty Pants, can you at least give us some general advice? Yes, I can. Now, the first thing you want to do, task number one, is to divide and clarify. And when I say divide and clarify, it's not dividing and clarifying the innovation, it's figuring out what options are we actually looking at? What projects could we take on? And when I use this picture of the white doors becoming colored, it's to show that there is a difference. We need to create that difference in the innovation projects we're choosing between, because it's very tempting to say, okay, let's say we're trying to figure out let's say we're a paint company and we're trying to figure out a new formula for our paint to make it last longer, to make it kind of need less layers of paint in less time. I know it's a little bit of a weird example, but bear with me. So an easy way would say, okay, how about we try adding a little bit of this into it? Or how about we try adding a little bit more into it? Or how about we try adding a lot more into it? Or how about we try adding a little of this into it or a little of that? Well, these are all specifically different things you can try out, and that's great. Innovation is specific, but at their core, they're fundamentally the same. They're looking at the formula of the paint itself. They're not looking at the business model. They're not looking at the organization. They're not looking at the audiences. They're not looking at fundamentally, are we selling paint or knowledge of paint? What problem are we fixing? Fundamentally, even though there might be 100 different experiments hidden there, 100 different small innovation projects, they're fundamentally the same. So the first thing you want to do, task number one, is you want to figure out, okay, what kind of options do we have here? What kind of places can we even look at? If you're not doing paint, if you're not a paint company, then it makes very little sense to play around with the paint formula, just to give an example. So the first thing is finding out how to make those bland white doors that all look the same, how to make them differentiated, how to make them colorful, how to say, okay, this is this door, this is that door, this is this option, this is that one. That's still a little bit vague and a little bit kind of, what do you mean by that? So I'm going to give you a couple of options. Since I have 7 doors on the picture, I'm going to give you 7 different options. Now, option number one, the hole-in-one innovation. The hole-in-one innovation project. This is what we all want. The thing where it's timely, it's needed, we have budget, we have buy-in, we have vision, it's the right thing, and it's just the right amount of energy and just the right amount of impact and just the right amount of stress. It's all the good stuff in one. Now, these innovation projects happen. Sometimes when you're looking at something, whether you're a huge company or a small startup or an NGO or a governmental entity, sometimes there's that thing that's just right. That's like, this is where we should put our energy. This is what we should be doing. Sometimes, but rarely. Now, much more often, you have an option. That option is to say, okay, let's do the tiny change. Let's move the trash can around. Let's paint the walls a different color. Let's show up an hour later tomorrow. Let's not have that meeting. The tiny change. And when I talk to organizations, one of the things I often ask them as one of the first questions is, not the organization, but the individual I'm talking with, saying, what is the biggest change you can do without asking anybody's permission? Can you change the name of the company? Can you change who you're selling to? Can you fire a lot of people or hire a lot of people? Can you make huge sweeping changes, or can you make small ones? And usually people, when they think of it, they're like, oh, okay, I can't make that big changes without involving somebody. And say, okay, that's great. But what is the biggest tiny change you can make? And then they come up with something. Maybe they can spend $100,000 on creating a project. Maybe they can spend $100, depending on the size and their influence. But they always come up with something. And I say, good, do that. Try something within that reach. Try moving something around, doing a tiny, small experiment, a tiny, tiny change. Maybe it's something that's free. Maybe it's a culture-based thing. Maybe it's you start high-fiving your colleagues at work. I once worked at a workplace where we did that. That was actually super cool. Maybe you start doing something else. Maybe you have a moment of silence. Maybe you do meditation. There's tons of options for free. There's tons of options for cheap. And there's always options within your specific scope, your specific power level, influence, whatever we want to call it, decision-making capability. So tiny changes, that's one option. The second option is the big, broad, sweeping change across a whole organization. It's the big thing. It's changing everything we are and everything we do. It's the bold new path. Now, usually, to make that sort of change, you need to be one of the top decision makers. You need to have buy-in, all that sort of thing. But this is another route to go. This is another kind of innovation track to follow, that you're going big. It's go big or go home. And going big has its own advantages, plenty of disadvantages. But the moment you're doing something big, the huge experiment, then there's a whole different level you're operating at. Now, that often is not possible. So one way of going from that, without saying, okay, I don't want to do the tiny changes. I've moved my trash can around enough. Thank you. And we're tired of the high-fiving, Klaus. Let's move on to something a little bit bigger. Well, then you do an isolated test. Maybe you take something in one of your divisions. Maybe you say, in this room at our school, we're going to do it differently. Maybe you're doing it at this specific meeting or this specific event or this specific part of the website or this specific tourist experience you're selling. Whatever it is, an isolated test. And the nice thing about isolated tests is you can go pretty crazy. And then you can take what you've learned, both positive and negative, and you can either kind of scale that up or roll it out, whatever you want to call it, or you can say, okay, we're definitely not doing that again. So an isolated test is a great way to approach an innovation project. If you don't want to do tiny changes, you can't do the grand experiment, or maybe you don't want to, then an isolated test is a good door to walk through. Option number 5, the indirect fix. Now that's something that I really love, is when a company or an organization is in some sort of trouble, or they're trying to break through some wall and they're just punching and punching and punching and hitting their heads on that wall and nothing's happening. Then trying something else. Maybe you can't change the price tag. Maybe you can't change the governance structure. Maybe you can't change the objectives that your organization is following. But what if you could change something else? What if you could change the language? What if you could change the stuff you do when you're off work hours? What if you could change the way you talked about the organization? What if you could not change the marketing, but you could send it to completely different people? You could change the targets. There are many things you can do where you're not attacking a problem head on, but you're attacking kind of from the side or looking at a different problem. In relationships and in kind of couples counseling, the classic example that's always brought up is one person says, I don't love, or you don't love me anymore. And the other said, is this because I didn't do the dishes? Because it's not about the dishes, it's about more. But sometimes the dishes can be a symbol of that more. And maybe by doing those dishes, you're actually indirectly saying, I love you. Even though the problem isn't the dishes, of course it's not. It's the feeling of trust and of being respected and acknowledged, that sort of thing. In a business context, in an organizational context, there are tons of these things where we can't attack the problem straight on. We can't give people pay raises. We can't change their hours. We can't fire the boss. We can't remove the stakeholders. But we can do all sorts of things to change something else that will indirectly affect that. That's what I call option 5, the indirect fix. If none of these are possible, maybe you're very junior in an organization, maybe you have a precarious position, maybe you're not in a place where you can make a lot of suggestions, maybe you're just executing, then there is the opportunity to have what I'd call the lovely idea. And the lovely idea has the incredible advantage that anyone can talk about ideas, anyone can share ideas. Not anyone can get away with it. Sometimes you get in trouble in organizations for sharing ideas. But in theory, anyone can come up with an idea and anyone can start to spread that idea. It doesn't matter if you are the lowliest clerk in a huge international bank like Deutsche Bank, or if you are the chief of sales at a huge corporation, or maybe you are the guy who packs the van in your logistics company. You have ideas, you have insights, you can float them to other people. You can see if they travel. If you have an idea that's powerful enough, you share it with somebody, they're going to share it with somebody else, and they're going to share it. And at some point, if it's good enough, if you're lucky enough, it's been communicated well enough, it's going to end up on a decision maker's table. So an innovation project that you can start at any time, anywhere, is spreading that lovely idea. Because there, you always have that permission to come up with ideas. You don't always have permission to share them. I grant you that. But usually you can get away with it somehow. In most organizations, openly. In some, you'll have to be a little bit circumspect about it. But option number 6 is the lovely idea, and seeing if you can make that travel to the people who actually can implement it. Because maybe you're not in that position, and that's okay. Now there's one door left, the white door, the boring door, the not so colorful one. Well, why is that? It's because option 7 is what I call the soul crusher. Now, why the hell would anyone have a door, an option for an innovation project that's called the soul crusher? The reality is nobody chooses it on purpose. Nobody says, let's do an innovation project. It's going to suck out energy. It's going to suck out resources. It's going to make us turn on one another, and it's never going to get anywhere. Yet all too often, that's what happens. Why does it happen? Why do people pick that door? Well, they do it because the doors look like this. They don't see the color. They don't see the clarity. They don't see the options. They see, okay, here are doors. They're all scary. Therefore, the slide, they're all scary. They're all scary. We don't know what to do. So what we do is we try to make it safe. We try to only open the door a little bit. We try to make sure that we have a kind of safety line that's attached so when we're going through the door, somebody else can pull us out. We try to knock on the door first to see what's behind it. We try to do all sorts of shenanigans to make sure that if we fail, things don't go too wrong. Instead of choosing the type of door to walk through, instead of choosing an option that has small consequences by default, for example, the tiny change or the lovely idea, we try to do something big, and then we put in all sorts of guardrails, all sorts of safety measures. We make sure it doesn't go over budget. We make sure it doesn't go over time. We make sure it doesn't have impact the wrong places. We essentially do everything we can to make it safe. Now, there's just one problem with that. Innovation isn't safe. Innovation is messy. What I encounter a lot with organizations, with people, is they have this tendency that they say, we want things to be different. We just don't want to change. Now, at its core, innovation, well, that means change. You can't make things different if you don't want to change. And yet we so often try. We so often say, I'd like this to be different. I'd like this to be like this or like that or not like this, just as long as I don't have to change anything. And that is horribly tricky when you're working with innovation. Because the trick is to choose a door anyway. The trick is to say, I can't tell what's behind that door. And yes, I can knock on it. And yes, I can try it out. And yes, I can ask people. I can put in all sorts of these safeguards. But before I go through the door, I don't know what's going to be in there. And that's the trick. Choosing a door anyway, even though it's scary, even though you know it might be terrible, it might be painful, all sorts of things might happen. Because if you don't go through the door, you don't know what's there. And who knows? There might just be treasure. There might just be meaning. There might be connection. There might even be profit. There might be all sorts of things behind that door. But you don't know until you walk through it. I tried to elegantly click to the last slide. It failed, so now I'm going to do it. There. Because it's an important one. It says thank you.